Yeah, good morning, everyone. This is Trevor with Group 8, working with Tiffany. This week we decided to take a look at procedures and how those work. So first off, we wanted to find out a little bit more about a procedure. What is it? Book definition: procedure is a function with a void return type, which is just a fancy way of saying that you put something in and you get nothing back. But there's even more. There's even a more complicated definition. It's a reusable unit that encapsulates specific business logic of the application. Technically speaking, a PL/SQL procedure is a named block stored as a schema object in the Oracle database, which is a mouthful. But again, it just is a chunk of code that you send something into it, and it does something and doesn't necessarily return anything back. So, programs are built on functions and procedures. We're just, again, focusing on the procedure side, but there are some similarities between the procedures and functions. First, they're called black boxes, which, okay, black boxes are mystery boxes where something goes in and swirls around and then something pops out without necessarily knowing what's going on inside. But as coders, we should hopefully know what's going on. Bottom line, though, is both procedures and functions can be called from other PL SQL blocks. They can contain nested named blocks. Their default is a pass-by value, so you've got one item going into it, and that can't be changed, but obviously that can be overridden. Exceptions are handled. If it's not handled in the black box, then it'll propagate to the calling block. But you can have as many parameters as you need, and they're treated as database objects. There are some key differences, however, between procedures and functions. Procedures are focused on executing a process. Functions are typically doing a calculation of some type, whereas procedures, you pass a parameter to it to do some work, and it'll do that work, but it doesn't necessarily spit anything out. It just grinds through it and something happens. Whereas functions, will always return something, hence the return value, and you have to return value. So procedures are more of a series of steps to accomplish a task, whereas a function is a series of steps and calculations to provide a result. And that result is sent back to the calling function and then processed and used. Syntax for procedures, pretty straightforward. You've got the create or replace procedure header. You put the procedure name and whatever parameters you need into it. You make your declaration statements, and then you begin and make all your execution statements. If you're going to do some exception handling there, and then you end it. So the syntax is pretty straightforward, and it's something that we've been doing since we started doing SQL work. So the procedure is just a fancy name for all these lines of code to do something. One of the things we needed to clarify and understand is the inline versus autonomous transaction scopes. Just in review, what is a transaction scope? The transaction scope is it's literally just a thread of execution. It's a process, series of lines, and executing some commands. But they're typically controlled by save point, rollback, and commit commands. So the data is managed that way, and the transaction scope allows for the ACID compliance across 2 or more DML statements. And this is important to ensure that the DML statements are complying with each other, and that the data is complying with each other, with all the different pieces of data that are being used. Procedures have, like functions, have 2 types of scopes. They have inline or dependent scopes, and that's literally just a chunk of code that's in the main process. It just flies right on through it. And it's dependent on what's happening in that main process. The autonomous transactions or the autonomous procedures are where it's called out, and the main call then jumps over to this new procedure, and it runs independent of that process. So it can commit their autonomous transactions commit their work independent of the calling program. They're good to use when you need something to happen regardless of what's happening somewhere else, and whether it fails or not or works. And then anything you do, particularly in the DML, you have to commit those changes. Otherwise, those changes won't carry through. So both are used throughout, and it depends on how you want to set up your system and how complicated you want to get. Like functions, procedures have pass-by values and pass-by reference, or pass-by value or pass-by reference. So I just wanted to review that real quickly. A pass-by value is where a value is used, where they're called, receives a value. It can interact with the database, but they don't really. They're nothing. They're not a variable that you're going to change. It's an in-only variable. It means a copy of an external variable. And this whole optimistic and pessimistic thing, whatever. But if as an autonomous unit with the compile directive, it becomes optimistic and no wait module, meaning that it's just happy and doing its thing up front. Because optimistic people are happy people. If using an out mode parameter, it becomes pessimistic programming blocks. So truthfully, I don't understand why they have to call it optimistic and pessimistic. It makes no sense to me, but it just has to do when results are being passed forward and backwards, and how it's being managed. But the pass-by values are defined by 5 rules. Formal parameters must be defined as read-only or write-only variables, and it's passing in, and you can't do much with it. Formal parameters are locally scoped variables that can't be changed during the execution, so there's no manipulation of those variables. Can use any data type. Any formal parameter may have a default initial value. Any system reference cursor passed into this is not writable and therefore must be passed through an in-mode parameter. So that's a pass-by value procedure. Pass-by reference procedure. It's referencing one or more call parameters inside the procedure. These values can change. The calling procedure and the called procedure are using the same value stored in the same memory location, so it makes system management or resource management a benefit. You can use these for DML statements in a single transaction, and they function as pessimistic blocks by using the out mode parameters, meaning that it's managed by what it's sending back. The rules for pass-by reference: at least one formal parameter must be defined as a read-only or read-write variable in the out mode or the in-out mode. All formal parameters are locally scoped variables that you can change inside the procedure. And it can be any data type, and any in-mode formal parameters can have a default value, and then system reference cursors cast in the procedure is not writable and therefore must be passed through an in-mode parameter. So just in summary on procedures, first, understanding the transaction scope, allowing multiple DML statements with the ACID compliance guarantee, regardless if the statements work or fail. You can define procedures as pass-by value or pass-by reference modules. Pass-by value procedure is an optimistic program when you make it autonomous with a compiler. Pass-by reference procedures are pessimistic programs making a procedure an autonomous program with a compiler directive. It doesn't change its status as this pessimistic module. So Hopefully this helped explain a little bit about procedures and how we use them, difference between them and functions. So um, yeah, that's our presentation. Hope everybody has a good day and good luck with this week.